Okay, so today we will look at the concept of hidden Markov models. So far we have completed 6 modules and today we are starting the 7th module, that is the probabilistic and machine learning based sequence models. The outline of this lecture will be that we will start with some motivating examples for hidden Markov models. So we will start with a general example which is called as the occasionally dishonest casino problem, and then we will also look at biological example in this course, in this lecture, which is the finding CPG islands. During the lecture I will also give you a formal definition of HMMs, and I will give you an overview of what biological applications are, the list of biological applications where we use these HMMs. Now the efficient algorithms for HMMs such as Viterbi, forward backward parameter estimation, we will discuss all of these in the next lecture. So let us get started. When we speak about probabilistic models, what do we mean by this? So a probabilistic model is a system to simulate the object under consideration. For example, the object can be a family of DNA sequences and the model produces different outcomes with different probabilities. For example, a very simple model of DNA sequence of length n can be as following. So the model can, in the model we can assume that each nucleotide A, T, C or G occurs at random with probability, some probability Qx. So A would occur at probability Qa, T would occur at probability Qt and so on, and they occur independent of other nucleotides in the sequence. So the probability is independent of other nucleotides in the sequence. Then under this model we can say that the probability of sequence x1 up till xn is simply the product of the probabilities, that is qx1 times qx2 until qxn. So now let us start with a motivating example for hidden Markov models, and this is popularly known as the occasionally dishonest casino. This is a famous example that is typically considered for describing the purpose of HMMs. So in this, suppose we walk into a casino and let us say the dealer in the casino has 2 coins, one a fair coin and second a biased coin. In the fair coin the probability of heads and tails is equal, that is half, but for the biased coin let us say that the probability of heads is 3/4 and probability of tails is 1/4. Now suppose dealer used either a fair coin or a biased coin, then in that case suppose we observe the sequence H H T T T H, that is 2 heads, 4 tails and then finally a head. Now given this observed sequence, can we figure out which coin was more probable, that is which of the 2 coins is more likely, that is whether the dealer used the fair coin or whether the dealer used a biased coin? How will you address this question, or which one will you pick? So to do that we can do a quick calculation for this. So well, we can find the likelihood of observing the sequence assuming the coin was fair. So if the coin was fair, then the probability of observing this sequence will simply be 0.5 raised to power 7, because you have 7 coin tosses and observing the outcome of H or T, the probability is 0.5. So that is 0.5 raised to power 7, which comes out to be 0.0078. Now if we repeat this process for the biased coin, now observe that you have 3 heads in the sequence and 4 tails in the sequence. So given the probability distribution of the biased coin, we can calculate this as 0.75 raised to power 3 times 0.25 raised to power 4, which comes out to be 0.0016. So, in this case, because of these probability values, we can say that the fair coin is a better guess, that is the dealer is more likely to use a fair coin given this observation. Now, let us make this problem a little more interesting. So, what if the dealer can also switch coins at any point, and let us say that the probability of switching between the two coins is 1 by 10. So, suppose at a particular point, suppose the dealer is using a fair coin, then with 0.1 probability we are saying that the dealer can switch to a biased coin, and similarly if they have a biased coin they can switch to a fair coin with 0.1 probability. Now, in this case, if we go back to our original question, that is, given this observed sequence H H T T T H, can we guess which coin was used by the dealer at each point? How do we address this question? Well, this is where hidden Markov models come into play. So, this is not a trivial question, this requires a little more thought, but observe that now there are many possibilities that we have to consider. So, there are many possible sequences, that is, maybe the dealer started with a fair coin, maybe in the middle they switched to a biased coin, and later they again switched to a fair coin. So, there are many possibilities to consider, and the question is, how do we guess which coin was used by the dealer, or what is the most likely sequence of choices of the coin that the dealer would have used to generate this sequence. So, for such problems the HMMs serve as a generalization. So, now think of a hidden Markov model as an abstract machine with a set of hidden states, and each state emits symbols from alphabet sigma. In our previous example where we were looking at the coin tosses, the hidden states were the fair and biased coin, that is the usage of fair coin or usage of biased coin. Those were the hidden states, and each state emitted either head or tail, that is the alphabet was head comma tail. Each state emits symbols using its own probability distribution. So, this was also there in the previous example where depending on the state, that is a fair coin or a biased coin, the probability distribution of observing a head or tail differs depending on the coin being used. The machine switches between states according to some other probability distribution. So, for example, we discussed that the dealer can switch between the fair and biased coin, and when the machine is in a certain state, then machine makes two decisions. One, which symbol from the alphabet sigma to emit, and second, which state should I move to next. That is, if I am currently using fair coin, then should I be using a fair coin next or should I be using a biased coin next. So, these are the two choices that the machine makes at each point. Now, again, so we can visually look at the hidden Markov model for the casino problem using this figure, where you have two hidden states, fair and biased. Between these states we can transition. So, these are the state transition probabilities, that is you can switch between fair and biased with probability 0.1, and if you have a fair coin, then you will remain with the fair coin with probability 0.9. And observe that at each state we emit these symbols from the alphabet, that is H or T, with some probability distribution. So, at fair coin we are emitting them with equal probability, and at the biased coin we are emitting heads with probability 3/4 and tail with probability 1/4. So, this is how one can visually look at these hidden Markov models, and this is the common practice of drawing the hidden Markov models. So, we will use following notations when we are discussing hidden Markov models. So, as we saw, sigma is the alphabet of symbols that are being emitted by the HMM. We will refer to Q as the set of states, that is, in our previous example Q was head and tail, Q was fair and biased, and the matrix A is a matrix of size q cross q, where each element of this matrix tells me the probability of moving from one state to other state. So, for example, the k comma lth entry of this matrix will tell me the probability of moving from state k to state L. Similarly, I am using this notation capital E to denote the emission probability. This is a q times sigma sized matrix, where the entry k comma b is the probability of emitting symbol B when we are in state k. So, again if we look at all these notations, so then for the same example that we have been considering, sigma would be h comma t, because these are the symbols that the HMM is emitting. The set of states is fair comma biased, these are the hidden states, and the state transition probability based on this HMM is shown on the left, where you can observe that, for example, moving from state F, that is the moving, if you have a fair coin, then we stick with the fair coin with probability 0.9 and we switch to biased coin with probability 0.1. Similarly, if you are at we are using a fair coin, then the probability of observing a head is 0.5 and probability of observing tail is also 0.5. So, this is how we interpret the state transition matrix as well as the emission matrix. Observe that the sum of values in a row of matrix A will always be 1. Similarly, the sum of all the probability values in a row of matrix E will also be 1, right. Okay. So, now we can move forward. Now, let us just interpret the term hidden Markov model. So, why do we call this model as hidden? Well, as you can guess, as observers we only see the emitted symbols of an HMM, but we cannot see the state where the HMM is currently at. So, for example, if in this example we have been looking at this sequence H H T T T H. So, these are the observations that we have, and we cannot see the states at which the HMM was at each step, and this is something that we will need to infer, that is what are the most likely hidden states based on the given sequence of emitted symbols. So, this is something that we will have to infer, that is what is the most likely sequence of hidden states based on the observation that we have. Then the second term in the hidden Markov model is Markov, and that is because we are using the Markov assumption. So, suppose a path pi equal to pi 1 up till pi n represents a sequence of states, right. So, for example, maybe we started with a fair coin and then the dealer switch to a biased coin and then a fair coin again and so on. So, let us say there is a path pi which represents a sequence of states. Then we are using this Markov assumption because the probability of state pi depends only on the previous state pi I minus 1 in the hidden Markov model, that is, it is not depending on the entire previous sequence. That is, in mathematically we can say that the probability of pi I given the previous states pi I minus 1 till pi 1 is equal to probability of pi I given pi I minus 1. That is to say that the probability only depends on the previous state, and this is where we are using the Markov assumption. So, now given these definitions of hidden Markov model, we can start with a very simple question. So, suppose somehow we learned that the dealer used the fair coin for the first 2 coin tosses as well as the last 2 coin tosses, and suppose the dealer used the biased coin for the 4 tosses in between. This is to say that this time we know the sequence of states through some way. So, we can write the sequence of states as F F B B B B F F. Now, given this knowledge of the sequence of states, can we answer the following question: what is the probability of observing sequence tail head tail head 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 tail head, that is TH TH H TH. So, given this sequence of states, what is the probability of observing this sequence of symbols? How do we answer that? Well, that is simple, because all we have to do is to look at the state transition probabilities from the HMM as well as the emission probabilities from the HMM, and this time we have the full knowledge, that is, we know both the observations as well as the sequence of hidden states. So, to that what we can do is we can simply write down the sequence of observations, we can write down the sequence of states, and for each state, suppose at the first point we know that the fair coin was used and we observed tail. So, for that we know that the probability of that happening is half, because a fair coin emits tail with half probability. Similarly, a fair coin emits head with half probability. The biased coin emits tail with 1/4 probability, then again it emits head with 3/4 probability, 3/4, 3/4, 1/2 and again half. So, this is because we know from the emission matrix that when we are at particular state, what is the probability of seeing head or tail. We have to also account for the state transitions. So, assume that the dealer started with biased coin with the probability half, right. So, we will say that the initial probability of using a fair coin is half. Then observe that the first transition is from state F to state F, and from the hidden Markov model we know that this is the probability of that happening is 0.9. So, we can write it as 9/10. Similarly, next time we are switching from state F to state B, that is, we are switching from a fair to biased coin. So, this will be 1/10. Similarly, we are sticking with the biased coin. So, that will remain 9/10, 9/10, 9/10. Then we are switching, that will 1/10, and then we are retaining the fair coin. So, that will be 9/10. So, this is how all the probability values look, and now all we have to do to answer our question is just to take the product of all these probabilities. Once you have taken the product of all these probabilities, we will answer the probability of observing the observed sequence given our knowledge of the state sequence. So, this is the simplest question probably that one can answer with HMMs. So, that is given the path of sequence states, what is the probability of observing a particular sequence of symbols. Now, so far we have discussed a general model, we have not addressed of why are these HMMs relevant for biology. Well, it turns out that HMMs are used for a variety of biological problems such as finding genes in a genome, sequence alignment including both pairwise as well as alignment of multiple sequences, protein secondary structure prediction, modeling sequencing errors in DNA sequences as well as base calling. So, there is a variety of applications, and let me zoom into one of these in more detail. So, let us say, so in this example I am considering the application of finding CG islands in a genome sequence. So, let me give you the biological context. So, it turns out that about 42% of the human genome comprises either G or C characters, and based on this observation, like one would expect to see the CG tumor, that is G followed by C. So, one would expect to see the CG occurrence of CG at rate 0.21 times 0.21. So, because the fraction of the genome comprising either G or C is 42%, one would expect that occurrence of CG would occur at rate of 4.41%. However, it turns out that in reality the actual frequency is less than 1/5 of the expected frequency, and the biological reason for that is that the cytosine, that is the C character of a CG, is easily methylated, that is it becomes chemically modified because of the attachment of methyl molecule on the DNA sequence, and also it turns out that the methylated Cs are easily mutated into T characters, and this is why from an evolutionary perspective the human genome has a much less frequency of CG bases. Now, given this context, it turns out that the methylation phenomena is suppressed around genes. So, wherever we have genes in the entire genome sequence, in the surrounding regions the methylation is suppressed, and there CG appear at relatively higher frequency in these important areas because of the methylation is suppressed. So, there is no this issue, the methylation issue does not occur around the gene sequences. So, these localized area with higher CG frequency are called as CG islands, and therefore, finding these CG islands within a genome sequence is among the most reliable gene finding approaches. So, because if we can locate these CG islands reliably, then we know that the complete gene sequence is in the vicinity of that CG island. Now, this problem can be modeled using HMMs efficiently. So, for example, one can model this problem using HMMs using this in this manner. So, for example, using the available sequences and information, what we can do is we can model the sequences based on how they look inside the CPG island, and we can model the sequences based on how they look outside the CG island, and we can allow a small probability of transition between the two regions, And such a model can now help us address that. Now suppose you have a given long sequence, like a long sequence or maybe entire genome, then such a model can help you identify the islands inside the sequence. In this figure I am not showing you the emission probability, I am only showing you the hidden states, but the emission probabilities are obvious, that is A plus emits A with probability 1 and the remaining bases it emits with probability 0. Similarly, G plus emits G with probability 1 and it emits other bases with probability 0. So, that those emission probabilities are obvious, and we can use 8 states, 4 for the sequences inside CPG island and 4 for the sequences outside the island. And based on this model we can infer the islands inside the genome sequence. So, I hope you understand and get a flavor of how and why HMMs are important for biological applications. Again, they address a variety of applications as we saw here, and in all those cases we would be using different models to address those applications. So, that covers the topics for this lecture. In the next lecture we are going to look at various algorithms for HMMs. In particular, we will definitely focus on more time on the Viterbi algorithm, which is used to predict the most likely sequence of states given some observation data. Thank you.